Welcome to Cozy Tales. We create long, slow, cozy mystery stories made for deep rest. Tonight's story unfolds gently with small clues, a quiet puzzle, an answer that never rushes to arrive. These stories are made for quiet listening with soft narration, steady rhythms, and space for the day to gently settle. If you're winding down for the night, you are in the right place. A like and subscribe helps us keep these stories coming every week. One more thing before we start. This story isn't just calm for you, it's built the same way for your pets. So if there's a pet curled up nearby, they're settling into this same steady voice too. And the next time you head out the door, you can safely leave this playing for them, because being alone doesn't have to feel alone. Now let's get comfortable. Let's begin. Chapter 1. Morning light settled along the front window ledge as though it had done so for years and saw no reason to change. It found the glass faces of the small traveling clocks one by one, laying a pale gleam across each in a slightly different shape. One held a narrow white stripe at its edge. Another gathered the light into a soft square over its dial. A third gave back only a dim pearl shine because the glass there had the faintest old waviness in it. Beneath them, the wood of the ledge showed places worn satin smooth by hands that had rested there, adjusted a case, lifted a clock, checked a latch, set something back exactly where it belonged. All through the front of the shop, ticks moved in overlapping measures, never quite together and never quite apart. The quiet industry of springs and wheels carrying on with the steadiness of water moving over stones. At the workbench, a drawer slid open with a softened wooden sound, the kind made only by a drawer that knew its runners well. Inside, cream paper and folded tissue lay in patient order. Careful fingers lifted a delicate part clear from its place, no larger than would disappear in a closed hand, though no hand here ever closed roughly around such things. Tissue came up around it in two light folds, then a third, each crease pressed with the same even pressure on either side. The parcel returned to the drawer without touching the edges. The drawer itself closed on a measured little click. Cream paper, folded tissue, and the faint dry scent of metal warmed by sun gave the bench the look of a place used fully and kept kindly. Nothing crowded anything else. Tools had room enough to be themselves. A loop waited near the corner, and a soft cloth lay flattened from earlier use. The drawer front sat flush when shut, and the hand that had closed it lingered only long enough to feel that it had landed properly. Moving away from the bench, Rowan gave the small traveling clocks their usual glance in passing. It was never the glance of someone admiring a row of pleasant objects. It was a check for agreement. One ear caught the spacing between ticks, and a hand paused near a bezel, not touching, only feeling the nearness of its place. The floorboards beneath his feet had their own slight language, and he crossed them as if timing could travel up through wood and leather soles and settle in the body before it reached the mind. The morning had already arranged itself into familiar measures: bench, drawer, tissue, ledge, listen, look, touch only after looking had done its work. A tiny irregularity rose out of the chorus before any visible flaw did. It was small enough that another ear might have let it pass entirely. One beat held a breath longer than expected. One tick set itself a hair away from the pattern around it. The pause that followed was untroubled. He stood still and listened again, trusting the sound of things behaving almost properly. In a room full of clocks, the obvious trouble often announced itself late. The nearly proper thing was the one that asked to be heard. The drawer was opened once more, though there was nothing unsafe within it now. The tissue around the wrapped part was straightened again, one corner eased flatter, one edge tucked with a thumbnail. It was a habit of finishing one task cleanly before beginning the next. Only then did he turn fully toward the window ledge, bringing the same bench-made steadiness with him. The row of small, traveling clocks held to its ordinary order, each with its own little measure of space. Between them, where no repair item belonged, a watch chain charm shaped like a small compass caught the light. It did not glitter. It simply sat there, interrupting the ledge, in the practical way a misplaced screw interrupts a tray. Once seen, it could not be taken for anything except wrong placement. The wood around it looked clean at a glance. Looking again changed that. Dust lay so lightly across the ledge that only the slant of the morning made it visible. But there, just beside the charm, a narrow crescent showed where something small had rested recently and no longer did. The mark was not broad enough for one of the clocks. It curved too neatly to be a random wipe of a sleeve. Before touching the charm, he bent nearer and read the absence as carefully as any object. A glance moved from one small traveling clock to the next. Their spacing remained as it should be. None leaned where it ought to stand straight. None had been nudged into another's place. The disturbance belonged to that one point alone. Because everything else kept its order, the compass charm seemed less like something dropped in passing and more like something deliberately left. Two fingers lifted it from the ledge. The metal gave a restrained sound, a tiny click against itself, and the weight that settled into his hand was lighter than expected. Not hollow exactly, incomplete. The kind of lightness that suggested company had gone missing. Curiosity narrowed into finer attention. The chain slipped over his fingers with a soft, dry movement, and where the charm met that chain, a faint edge of cream paper showed, caught too neatly to be a scrap from packing. The sight tied the object at once to the drawer just closed, to tissue and folded paper and deliberate handling. This was no longer a matter of tidying what had wandered onto the ledge. It had to be traced. He brought the charm nearer the window and turned it until the pale light entered the seam at its back. The tiny hinge yielded with care. Inside, tucked under the back plate, sat a paper circle trimmed with such precision that it could only have been made for this exact interior. Cream paper again, not torn to fit, but cut to fit. It lifted free onto his palm with the gentlest drag against metal. One line of writing remained clear enough to catch the eye at once. Before the last chime, written across the upper half in a hand that pressed evenly, neither hurried nor ornamental. Beneath it, another line had been rubbed nearly away. Only the fact of its erasure remained obvious at first. The graphite thinned into a gray weather over the paper. The missing words drew more attention than the surviving ones. He let the paper rest flat on his palm rather than setting it among the tools on the bench behind him. A hidden message had already stepped beyond accident. One rubbed partly away asked for slower handling. Near the center, where the paper curved slightly from having lived inside the back plate, a time had been written twice. The first was plain enough, 8:10. A single line crossed through it. Beside it, in a darker, more certain mark, sat 8:16. The correction was small, exacting. 6 minutes. The sort of amendment made by someone who believed those 6 minutes changed the use of the note itself. The crossed-out time had not been dismissed in haste. The line through it was neat. The replacement carried a firmer edge, though whether that meant a different hand or only a different moment could not yet be trusted. What mattered was the care of the correction. Someone had wanted 8:16 to replace 8:10 exactly. Morning had moved well beyond both times. Rowan checked the nearest traveling clock, found it running steadily, and returned his attention to the paper. The note was not recording the hour in front of him. It was pointing toward something that had already happened, or something that had been meant to happen. At the bottom edge of the cream paper, where the cut circle should have ended in a clean arc, a blank strip ran crosswise. It was narrower than a finger and too straight to be chance. The cream there stood brighter than the handled paper above it, as if something long and slim had once been fixed there and removed. On the reverse, a tiny grease crescent carried the narrow pressure of worked metal. A winding stem was only one possibility, but the shape suited one, especially if it had been wrapped against the paper for protection. The note had not traveled alone. A penciled arrow in one corner pointed neither to the writing nor to the corrected time. It angled outward toward the rim of the charm, an instruction meant for someone who already knew what to compare. The bell above the front door gave a clear single ring. Rowan folded the note along its existing curve, laid it with the open charm on a square of clean cloth, and turned as a customer stepped into the shop with a wristwatch wrapped in a soft handkerchief. The customer approached the counter carefully, as though the damage might worsen if the watch were moved too quickly. When the cloth opened, a slim silver case appeared beneath it. The crystal had cracked from the 4 to the 6, and one splintered edge had lifted just enough to catch the light. "It slipped from the bedside table," the customer said. "It still runs, but the minute hand stops down here. I thought perhaps I had made it worse by winding it." Rowan accepted the watch by its edges and set it on a leather pad beneath the bench lamp. He did not press the crystal flat. Instead, he lowered the loop, changed the angle of the light, and watched the minute hand make its way around. The movement continued smoothly until the hand reached the damaged half of the dial. There it slowed, touched the underside of the crystal, and held. He lifted the watch before the mechanism could strain against the obstruction. "The hand is catching," he said. "The movement may be fine underneath. You did the right thing by bringing it in before forcing it." The customer let out a small breath. "Can it be repaired?" "Yes. I will remove the loose glass first, then check the hand and the movement before fitting a new crystal." The customer touched the folded handkerchief left on the counter. "It belonged to my mother. It is not especially valuable, I suppose. I would rather the scratches were left as they are." Rowan looked once more at the case, at the fine wear along its sides, and the place near the clasp where years of fastening had softened the metal. "It has been kept running," he said. "That usually means it is valuable to someone." He placed the watch in a shallow felt-lined tray and covered it against dust. On the repair slip, he noted the cracked crystal, the stopped hand, and the customer's request that no other visible marks be polished away. The worn places belonged to the watch as surely as the numbers on its face. While he wrote, the customer moved toward the front window, careful not to lean against the ledge. Their attention passed from a round nickel clock to a square brass case with a dark green face, then to a smaller one whose leather covering had faded at the corners. "Are these for sale, or are they waiting for repairs too?" "Some are finished," Rowan said. "The ones without tags are still waiting." The customer bent slightly to read the small cards tucked beneath the bases. A hand rose once toward the dark green clock, then stopped short of touching it. "Do they all chime?" "Only a few. Their cases are small, so none of them has much room for a voice." As though the room had chosen to demonstrate, a clock farther along the wall marked the quarter hour with a thin, bright note. Another answered more softly from a shelf behind the counter. The two sounds did not match, but they settled into the ticking without disturbing it. The customer listened until the second note faded. "They sound smaller than I expected." "The cases change the sound," Rowan said. "Even clocks made alike rarely speak alike for long." He tore the claim portion from the repair slip and passed it across the counter. The customer tucked it into a wallet, thanked him, and left with the empty handkerchief folded into one palm. The door closed. Its bell trembled once more and faded into the layered ticking. Rowan returned to the window, but the interruption had changed the way the row reached him. For several minutes he had listened to a damaged watch describe its trouble while another person moved among the clocks. Now the hidden note and open charm waited on the cloth exactly where he had left them, and the phrase before the last chime seemed less abstract than it had before. He first tested the dust crescent, The base of the nearest clock was too broad, and the compass charm too compact. When the paper was folded lightly along its natural bend and held beside the mark, the curve suggested the edge of another slim object that had rested there only briefly before being lifted away. He tilted the note until the rubbed-away line caught the morning at a slant. Graphite had vanished from sight more completely than pressure had vanished from the paper. No full sentence emerged, but the tail of one word did. Stem. The grease mark and blank strip no longer offered only a possibility. A small mechanical stem had been wrapped with the note, and it was missing now. The drawer at the bench opened again. Tissue weighted around the delicate part just as it had been left, except for one softened corner marked by a faint gray touch. It matched the grease on the note closely enough to connect the two. The hidden packet and the drawer's contents had met at some point, though nothing yet showed whether that meeting had happened inside the shop. Rowan settled the tissue back into place and returned to the penciled arrow. Following its direction to the charm's rim revealed a tiny notch, crisp beneath the ordinary wear. Seen from the side, it had enough depth to hold the edge of something narrow and keep it aligned. The chain offered one further sign. 3 links near the clasp were brighter than the rest, recently handled and worked more than once. The charm had not simply been carried to the ledge, it had been opened, adjusted, and closed again. The pieces formed one practical arrangement, a winding stem wrapped against the cream paper, held in position at the notch, and transported inside the charm. The clean strip showed where it had lain. The grease crescent showed where the metal had pressed. The erased word named it. Someone had removed the stem without damaging the note and left the carrier behind. Rowan looked again at the surviving instruction. In a shop where ticks overlapped and several clocks marked the hour in different voices, before the last chime could not mean every chime. It pointed toward one expected sound in this particular row. The clocks on the window ledge were listened to again, this time with a more selective ear. Which of them would offer a distinct enough chime to deserve the name of the last chime from someone familiar with this very row? Some spoke only in ticks. Some had tiny bell voices that would ring when properly wound. Morning had not yet called all of them to announce themselves. He moved along them slowly, hearing the room's layered measures sort themselves by proximity and strength. In that listening, one stillness emerged. Among the running clocks sat one unwound and silent. Its silence had hidden until now among the busier sounds around it. In a room full of movement, stillness can wear good camouflage. The clock's face looked ordinary enough where it stood, but no tick came from it, no faint internal stir. What might have been taken for oversight shifted into possibility. If there was a particular sounding meant by the note, then a clock that should have chimed and did not had to be reckoned with. He lifted the unwound small traveling clock from the ledge. The case felt cool where the others had taken a little warmth from the sun. Turning it toward the light, He checked its setting against the corrected time on the paper. The hands stood at 8:16. They did not have the lax imprecision of a clock that had wound down naturally and settled somewhere near. The stop was exact. The minute hand aligned cleanly. The hour hand held its proper relation. This clock had been stopped at 8:16. That answered one question cleanly. The written correction had been meant to match a clock that mattered. He held the silent traveling clock in one hand and the open charm in the other. If this clock had once chimed as part of the front window's little chorus, its final sounding, before being stopped, might be the one named in the note. Whatever was meant to happen before that sound had been tied to 8:16. Removing the winding stem ensured the clock could not simply be set right again. The cream paper was folded once more, this time around nothing. Its existing creases still suggested the narrow shape it had held. Rowan slipped the empty packet into a pocket, keeping it close as a guide rather than returning it to the charm. On the cleared part of the ledge, the charm was set beside the silent small traveling clock. The rest of the clocks remained where they had always stood, their ordinary spacing preserved. This small arrangement altered the use of the window. Display gave way to evidence. A stopped face, an open carrier, a gap in the dust where something slim had rested and gone. Behind him, the drawer sat closed, tissue settled, its wrapped, delicate part undisturbed except for the knowledge now attached to it. The shop's ticking continued in all directions, but it had receded behind a firmer line of attention. Somewhere beyond the ledge and the pocketed paper lay the path of one missing mechanical piece, and whatever had been meant to happen before 8:16 had already passed into waiting. Chapter 2. The rinsed cloth came up from the basin with a cool, heavy drag and laid itself over the line-drying rail as though it meant to stay there for the afternoon. Water darkened the old wood in a long stripe before beginning its slow crawl downward. Under one broad hand, the weather notes kept their place against the breeze that wandered in from the river. The rail had gone silver with years of wet mornings and dry evenings. Its grain lifted a little where weather had worried it open. A thumbnail could find every ridge without looking. Near the cap of the rail sat an enamel mug with a ring of old tea dried around the inside. Its handle faced outward from habit. A faint brown crescent marked the wood where it had stood before. Through the nearby window, beyond a wavering reflection of the yard, the driftwood piece on the sill held a pale strip of river light along one smooth edge, as if the water had left a memory of itself there and the day had found it again. The papers beneath his hand made a soft layered sound when the breeze pressed and released them. One brass clip tapped lightly against another. The cloth shifted once, then settled. Out on the river, whatever moved did so quietly enough that these little sounds carried whole, untroubled by anything larger. The morning's weather had already been read once for cloud and rain, and once more for what dampness might do to wood, to brass, to any task requiring a steady temper. Such reading had become less a ceremony than a practical courtesy paid to the day before asking work of it. The unfinished line from the shop had not stayed in the shop. It had followed him here in separate pieces, each as plain and unresolved as if laid out on a bench under a lamp. 816, the missing winding stem, the compass charm's notch, and the surviving words before the last chime. Thinking at them had not improved them. Yet the same attention used to judge a stopped mechanism had drifted naturally to the papers clipped near the rail, looking for what sat out of true. The brass fastener on the river chart had turned slightly offline. A thumbnail nudged it straight before the chart itself was read. The motion came and went without announcement, one small correction among many that filled a day. A bent hinge, a loose screw, a warped card edge, a latch that failed to meet its catch, such things asked to be tested before they were trusted. Papers asked no less than metal. With the fastener sitting properly, the chart beneath showed its expected marks. Soundings, shore curves, practical notations made for use rather than admiration. What did not belong there appeared only after the notes were lifted enough to free a corner. A folded letter had been tucked beneath them, its edge aligned too neatly with the stack to have blown there. It did not sit with the chart itself. It waited under the weather pages, where a hand checking the day would almost certainly find it. The cloth remained half spread where it had been left. A chore simply paused in place, held there by one quiet wrongness among ordinary objects. The folded paper came up between finger and thumb. Before it was opened, it was weighed lightly from one side to the other, then along its fold. The paper had enough body to keep its shape, though damp had touched it at some earlier time and left a slight waviness near one edge. Fingertips checked the crease for thickness, then the center for any stiffness that might mean something had once been enclosed or had only recently been removed. The handling was exact, almost absent-minded in its exactness, the way a watch case might be turned in the palm before the back was lifted. No seal held it shut, no name marked the outside. The folds had been made with care and pressed flat enough to last through some carrying. The outer surface showed a little rubbing where it had met other papers. Along one corner, the paper was cleaner than the rest, as if protected for a while by something resting over it and then taken away. That detail did not yet become a conclusion. It simply joined the others. The top fold lifted. Inside, the first line did not begin with a greeting or a place or any ordinary lead-in to a letter. Across the paper, in writing that moved carefully and a little stiffly, sat the copied phrase, "Before the last chime." The hand had taken pains with those words. Each letter stood more attended to than fluent, as though preserving them mattered more than moving quickly across the page. The line did not read like composition. It read like rescue. Below it, a second line had suffered rubbing or erasure. The beginning had gone thin enough to blur into the paper's grain, and what remained at the end was only stem. The surface held a pressure mark where pencil had once bitten harder, then softened. The eye could follow the force of the writing even where the graphite itself had nearly gone. Someone had written more, and the page now offered only the tale of a word or phrase and the physical memory of effort. The paper was tipped toward the light from the window. The copied phrase remained plain. The rubbed line changed depending on angle, offering almost letters and then refusing them. A finger hovered over the indentation without touching it. If this had been a message in its own right, the brokenness would have been one kind of trouble. If it was a second attempt to preserve words already fading elsewhere, the trouble changed shape. Then the page was not speaking for itself. It was carrying what another surface had failed to keep. Along one inner fold ran a narrow column of times, set apart from the rest of the writing as if added during a different moment of thought. 8:10 had been written first and crossed through once, not angrily, not scrubbed out, only corrected. Just above it, Saturday 8:16 in firmer pencil. Farther down the fold, faint enough to miss on a careless look, another 8:16 appeared beside a small tick mark. The paper was turned and turned back. The sequence mattered more than the numbers alone. 8:10, then crossed through, 8:16 above it, 8:16 again lower down. The repetition did not suggest guessing. It looked like someone catching an error and then making sure the corrected minute stayed put. That minute had already lodged itself in the day through the stopped small traveling clock. There, the hands had held at 8:16 with a kind of mute insistence. Here, on this separate paper, the same minute had been written, revised into place, and written again. If one object had been made to keep that time, why had another labored to fix it once more? The letter rested open over the weather notes while the mind moved around the minute from different sides. A mistake corrected once could happen to anyone. A corrected minute repeated beside a tick mark suggested memory being pinned down. Something had made that exactness worth the trouble. A deeper fold yielded another thing when the paper was eased apart more fully. A scrap no wider than a finger slipped free and had to be caught against the rail before the breeze could claim it. It had been torn from the margin of something printed. On it remained only the letters Ward, part of a ruled line, and beside that line a pencil dash made by hand. The paper stock differed from the letter's own surface. It was thinner, flatter, and more formal in the way printed forms often are, made for handling in stacks rather than for private writing. The scrap was too little to declare itself. Ward might belong to more than one word. A ruled line might belong to any list. Yet the fragment did not feel borrowed from ordinary correspondence. It hinted at a page built to organize movement, a notice, a roster, a route, some official narrow margin where information was meant to sit in order. The pencil dash beside the line suggested someone had marked a place on that larger printed thing before tearing this small piece away, or after it had torn loose. The paper in hand began to look as though it had touched another system entirely, one made of records and redirections and printed spaces waiting to be filled. The question shifted a little under that pressure. Who wrote this remained important. What page they had touched while writing it pressed just as close. Near the bottom crease, another mark waited so quietly that it might have gone unseen if the page had not been opened all the way. A penciled arrow pointed inward, not toward a word, but toward a tiny drawn circle crossed by a short line. It was no more than a practical little sketch, yet the shape caught the eye at once because it came near enough to a winding stem to stir recognition. Beside it crouched 3 cramped letters, WS, perhaps, though the strokes shook enough to leave room for doubt. The page was brought nearer. The arrow had been made with a quickness absent from the copied phrase at the top. It leaned slightly, pressing harder at the point. The tiny circle was not neat. The short line through it sat a touch off center. This was not ornament or symbol in any polished sense. It looked like someone trying to get the shape down before losing hold of it, drawing from memory rather than from a ruler's patience. WS, if that was what it said, did not explain itself. It might name a part, it might mark a place, it might be initials. The page offered no courtesy to a reader coming fresh to it. Whoever had set down the arrow and the drawing had done so as if the connection ought already to be known. That assumption left a gap wider than the mark itself. Somewhere beyond the paper, there was context enough to make this obvious. Here at the rail, there was only the suggestion of one. The folded letter lay flatter now, and with it, flatter details came clear. Near one side sat a faint rectangular clean patch, paler than the paper around it. Its edges were not sharply outlined, yet they held enough shape to show that another small slip had rested there for some time, sheltering that patch from weathering or from the touch of other hands. The rest of the page had dulled slightly with use. That small rectangle had not. Whatever occupied it was gone. The eye returned to the patch more than once. It was easy to imagine a missing thing whenever a shape remained after it. The compass charm from before had carried its own absence in a notch where something once belonged. This letter now did the same in paper form. A slim piece had been part of it, or had accompanied it long enough to leave a ghost of itself behind. He stood with the cloth waiting on the rail, and the weather notes shifted half aside beneath the open page, while each clue on the paper quietly altered the shape of the others. The copied words suggested preservation. The rubbed line ending in stem suggested loss or damage repeated. The corrected minute joined itself to the stop clock. The scrap of printed margin pointed outward toward some official handling. The little drawing reached toward the missing winding stem without fully touching it. The pale rectangle promised one more absent piece than the page could now supply. No test resolved any of it. No cleverness was forced onto it. The paper simply remained open long enough for its details to settle into place. Footsteps sounded on the path with a measured tidiness to them, heel and sole making a rhythm that belonged to someone arriving with purpose. Edith came into view carrying a small bundle of post balanced flat against her palm. The outside cool traveled with her, along with the dry scent of paper dust and the faint starchiness of envelopes kept in order. Before speaking, she set the bundle clear of the damp rail in one swift, practical motion, finding a dry patch as naturally as another person might clear a plate from a table. Her first glance went to the open page over the weather notes rather than to the river or the cloth. "That wasn't there when I passed earlier," she said. "No." The letter was turned slightly so she could see without needing to lean over the wet stripe on the wood. It was tucked beneath the weather pages. The small bundle remained under her hand, held square and safe from the damp. A clerk's habits had a way of continuing into every setting. Corners stayed aligned. Stacks remained stacks. When the torn scrap with "Word" was offered for a better look, her attention narrowed at once, not theatrically, simply with the concentration of someone who spent long hours among redirected things, forwarded things, labels gone astray and found again. "That bit may matter," she said, taking it by the very edge. The scrap was turned once between finger and thumb, then held against the light. The ruled line became more evident there, and the printed letters sat in their clipped little fragment as if waiting to be recognized by use rather than by language alone. She did not rush to name it. The post bundle rested untouched beside her while both looked down at the rail where the weather notes had unexpectedly become a work surface. The letter itself was lifted toward the window. Light through paper can be kinder to hidden writing than direct sight is, and the pale strip from the river gave enough brightness to show where pencil had once pressed harder than the eye could now read. Along the creases and beneath the rubbed line, indentations rose into view. Some strokes remained invisible as graphite yet stood there physically, shallow valleys in the page. A finger traced the air just above them. The task asked for patience of a particular sort, to follow lengths and spacing before deciding what any mark ought to mean. A guessed word too early could spoil all the rest. The line ending in stem was studied as shape rather than message. How long had the lost beginning been? Where had pressure deepened? Did the phrase run straight, or had the hand hesitated midway? The page answered slowly. "It's longer than one word," Edith said after a silence in which only the cloth gave a faint drip from the rail. "Or it was." He nodded, still watching the indentations. The surviving end sat too far to the right to have stood alone comfortably. Before it, the pressure marks suggested at least one more cluster of letters, perhaps two, with a slight gap that might be a space or only a lighter hand. If the end were merely a label stem, Written and partly rubbed away, the line would likely have arranged itself differently. This shape belonged to a phrase, perhaps an instruction or warning about the missing winding stem, rather than a simple naming of the part. The page was lowered and raised again at a different angle. The exact sentence would not come. It remained tantalizingly beyond reach, more suggestive for being sentence-shaped than if it had yielded a clean fragment at once. The eye could feel where meaning ought to be, the way a hand can feel a missing tooth in a gear before seeing it. Edith laid the torn scrap on the driest corner of the weather notes and turned it sideways. "This ruled edge," she said, touching near it without quite making contact, "looks more like the margin on forwarding slips than on ordinary letters." The words were offered carefully, with room left around them. No certainty was claimed. Still, the observation rested well on the scrap. Forwarding slips and arrival notices often used narrow printed margins and clipped wording, practical spaces designed for sorting and redirecting. Private stationery tended toward broader blankness, or at least a different sort of formality. This fragment had the compressed look of something administrative. "Could Ward be from that?" he asked. "It could." She tipped the scrap back toward herself. Forward, forwarded, even part of a place line if one was printed there. But this spacing, her thumb hovered beside the ruled line. It belongs to the sort of page meant to keep things moving. That phrase stayed. Meant to keep things moving. The scrap no longer suggested merely an official paper in the abstract. It pointed toward transit, redirection, a system in which objects passed through hands that recorded them without claiming them. The times on the letter were considered again, now in company. 8:10 crossed through once, 8:16 written above, a fainter 8:16 repeated lower down beside the tick mark. Seen after the scrap, they might have been tempted into code by anyone inclined to romance a mystery. Yet laid out plainly, they behaved more simply than that. Someone had written one time, corrected it, then fixed the corrected one again so it would stay remembered. "Looks like an error caught and mended," Edith said. "Yes." The paper tapped lightly as it shifted in his hand. A practical correction. The sequence was followed as behavior rather than puzzle. A wrong minute entered. A better minute replaced it. The better minute was repeated. Such actions belonged to anyone trying to preserve a detail that mattered and had nearly gone astray. That did not make the minute less important. It made it humanly important, which was often harder to dismiss. The copied phrase at the top, the corrected minute, and the little stem-like sketch began to lean toward one another. None of them looked invented for flourish. Each had the quality of being carried over from somewhere else with care. The page was becoming less like an original message and more like a backup, a second record made against loss. If one source were damaged, erased, or separated from a missing piece, this page might preserve enough to keep the cluster intact. He looked down at the careful hand that had copied the phrase and then at the rougher arrow near the bottom. Someone wanted this to survive, or wanted it to travel. Edith said. The distinction opened quietly between them. A page preserved for survival might remain hidden, tucked away against accident. A page preserved for travel might be folded, accompanied by fragments, perhaps passed through systems designed to move things from hand to hand. The scrap with its printed margin gave that thought somewhere to stand. If a forwarding slip had once been involved, the letter might have been redirected, enclosed, or saved in transit by someone who understood how messages can be carried indirectly. The pale rectangular clean patch was measured then against the idea nearest at hand. His gaze moved from the patch to the remembered width of a winding stem, then back. By eye alone, the fit failed. The absent thing had been broader and flatter than any clock part. A stem would have sat too narrow in that protected space and left a different sort of trace, if any trace at all. The refusal mattered. It prevented the page from collapsing inward into the same absence already attached to the clock. There were two missing pieces in play, related perhaps, but not identical. That held paper, he said. Yes, she replied, or something nearly as flat. The brass fastener on the river chart was loosened only enough to lift the chart and weather notes together. Underneath, the place where the folded letter had rested became clear. It had not been clipped in with the chart. It had been slipped beneath the weather pages alone, where anyone checking conditions would put a hand before doing anything else. The distinction seemed modest until looked at properly. One placement suggested storage. The other suggested intention. Edith watched the stack settle back. That was left for the person who reads the day before starting work. The line drying rail, the weather notes, the chart, the mug ring on the wood, none of these were secret. Yet the exact habit of checking the notes there, in that order, belonged to familiarity. Whoever tucked the page beneath them had known enough to trust where the hand would go. A stranger might have left it on the sill, under the mug, tucked into the chart itself. This had been placed for discovery by routine. A blunt pencil from beside the notes was used to copy the penciled arrow and tiny circle onto a blank corner of the weather page, sparing the original letter from repeated handling. The copied version looked clumsier at once, though the effort was careful. Reproducing a small sketch can reveal what the eye misses on first glance. The line through the circle in the original sat a little off-center, as if drawn by memory of how the part truly looked, rather than by any desire for symbolic neatness. That slight imbalance made it seem more practical, more tied to an object handled before. See there, he said, touching the copy rather than the original. If it were meant as a symbol, the line would likely be centered. Someone was remembering shape, she said. The three cramped letters beside it still refused certainty. WS remained the nearest reading, though the page would not promise it. Initials? A part named in shorthand? A place abbreviated by someone in haste? The copied mark on the weather notes made no answer appear. It only preserved the uncertainty in a safer format. The torn word scrap returned to the middle of the conversation when Edith set it beside the letter's copied wording and looked from one to the other. "If this came from a forwarding slip," she said, "then the page may have passed through hands that move things along without owning them." That idea widened the mystery in a useful direction. It did not identify who had stopped the small traveling clock or who had removed the winding stem. It did not tell whose careful hand copied the phrase or whose rougher hand added the arrow and tiny sketch. Yet it suggested a chain rather than a single point. Message, record, redirection, preservation. The paper may have been helped along by process as much as by intention. Someone in that process may have feared the original would not endure. Someone may have copied from one surface to another precisely because transit wears at edges, smudges graphite, tears enclosures free. A mystery centered on one maker can become narrow. One that includes handling becomes layered. The letter at the rail now belonged, perhaps, to several moments of touch. The bundle of post still waited where Edith had set it, square and patient, but it no longer claimed the purpose of her visit. Drying cloth and weather notes had yielded the morning to another sort of sorting altogether. Papers that would usually be glanced through and set in order now became supports for comparison. The folded letter was brought back along its existing creases with care, each fold encouraged rather than remade, and set apart from the ordinary pages the way a delicate movement part might be placed on clean cloth before any further work. The cloth on the rail had lost some of its dripping weight by then. Water no longer ran in threads from its lower edge. The mug remained where it was. The driftwood on the sill still held its pale line of river light. Around these steady things, one answer had settled enough to stand on its own. The folded letter was no random scrap caught by weather or left by mistake. It was a deliberate secondary record preserving the same cluster already tied to the stopped small traveling clock at 8:16 and the missing winding stem. Why a second record needed to exist remained open. Edith gathered the small bundle of post into neater alignment under her palm, though she still did not open it. "The fragment gives you a place to lean next," she said. "Use and process. Better than guessing at whose stationery it came from." He inclined his head. That was true. A forwarding slip or related postal record belonged to a world of procedure. Procedures leave patterns. Patterns can be checked. Together they carried the matter inside. The folded letter went first, held level and light. On the shelf near the jar of polished river glass, a clear place was made. The glass pieces, green and brown and one cloudy pale one, held the window light in their rounded surfaces, each softened by long water and longer time. Beside them, paper and pencil looked brisker, sharper in purpose. The letter was set there between the two kinds of object, as if the shelf itself had become a small working point where smooth found things and exact recorded things could keep company for a while. A fresh note was started on a clean page. The pencil moved steadily, making a list plain enough to return to later without embellishment. 816 corrected twice, before the last chime, stem, and possible forwarding slip fragment. The act did not solve anything. It kept the clues from drifting apart into separate impressions, the way loose weather pages might scatter if left untended by the river. Edith stood near enough to read the note as it formed. The post remained in her keeping, still unopened, while this temporary work took precedence. No further claim was made than the evidence allowed. The copied phrase had been preserved. The minute had been corrected and fixed. The broken line ending in stem likely belonged to a longer instruction or warning. The tiny drawing had been made from memory of a part. The pale rectangle marked another absent slip broader than any winding stem. The torn ward fragment most likely came from a forwarding slip or related postal paper. Enough had gathered to change the question. The matter was no longer only what the clues meant in isolation. It had become, with increasing firmness, a question of who knew enough about his habits to leave the folded letter beneath the weather notes where it would certainly be found. Whoever did it understood the route of the morning hand, rail, notes, chart, work. The river outside remained quiet. Through the window, the driftwood kept its pale edge. On the line-drying rail, the cloth still waited to be properly spread and clipped. The next step did not need naming yet. It only needed keeping. Chapter 3. The ledger had already been open long enough for the edge of Rowan's hand to warm the paper where it rested. A pencil moved in small, careful strokes beside the fresh list from the shelf, adding one more mark to the line already begun earlier. The clock-testing corner kept up its low, familiar ticking nearby, several small voices answering one another from the bench and the wall in tiny measured intervals. It was the sort of sound that did not ask to be noticed. It simply stayed, and by staying, held the room in order. The line on the page was finished, and the pencil lifted. A little graphite dust caught the light before settling into the tooth of the paper. To make room, the ledger was nudged aside only a few inches, enough to clear the patch of bench where the next item would go. Something pale showed beneath it, only the edge at first, a card corner, thick stock, used and slightly softened at the tip. It had no business being under the ledger, not after the shelf list had already been sorted and the ordinary papers put back where they belonged. The bench had a way of gathering things during a day's work, but this was not one of the places where a collection card should simply appear by chance. The ledger slid a little farther. The hidden card came free with that dry, fibrous sound old paper makes when it has been held flat under weight for a while. Nearby, the polishing cloth still lay where it had been left, and on it the case-opening knife rested exactly as it had been set down after the last plain bit of work, blade folded, handle angled toward the edge of the bench. The arrangement of those two things looked so entirely untouched that the card's presence under the ledger seemed all the more particular. It had been used, then left, not filed, not discarded. The fresh list on the shelf could wait. Attention turned back, away from what had already been guessed and written down, toward the smaller discipline of process. The card was pinched gently at one short end and lifted clear. Its stock was familiar even before the writing could be seen clearly. Sturdy enough for handling at a counter, plain enough to take pencil well, the sort of paper made to survive pockets, ledgers, baskets, and damp fingertips. A collection card, yes. But why here? And why under the ledger? And why folded so tightly? A stop test watch lay close by, where it had been set after the last comparison. Habit reached for it before curiosity reached for the card. The little watch was wound once with thumb and forefinger, only enough to ask the mechanism a question. The faint resistance came first, then the small catch in the works, and after that the delayed answer of the balance beginning to stir. Rowan held it near his ear until the first uncertain beat steadied into a proper tick. Only then was it set back down. The card waited. Its fold opened slowly, with care given to the crease rather than the contents. Use before intention. That was often the kinder way into a puzzle. A thing usually told more truth about what it had been made to do than about what someone had hoped to hide in it. On the outside, one side still carried bakery collection details in the plain, practical style expected of such a card. Names and ordinary handling notes, the kind of information that belonged near a till or a stack of wrapped orders. Yet, the inside fold had been given over to something else entirely. 3 times had been written there in a narrow hand, each set down with enough pressure to leave the strokes clear even in the dimmer grain of the paper. One of them stood darkest, 8:16. That same time had been corrected twice, as though someone had written toward it, doubted, amended, and then returned to it with firmer certainty. Beneath the times sat a line that did not belong to bakery collection at all. Before the last chime. The words had the look of something copied from elsewhere rather than composed there in the moment. The card remained open in both hands while the eye moved over the details again, slower this time. A collection card was not meant to serve as a second record for timing. It could be borrowed for that purpose, certainly, in haste or convenience. Yet the copied line and the repeated correction made the reuse look chosen. Someone had wanted these particulars to remain with this card, or at least on this card, long enough to matter. The fold gave a little more under the thumb. Inside that second opening, another fragment of writing showed itself. Near the top, separate from the times, were 2 initials, WS. Lower down sat a short, unfinished line ending only in stem. The dash before the letters made the fragment look clipped from a larger word. It was not a torn edge this time. The paper there was whole. The thought had simply stopped. Pencil had lifted and never returned. Whoever put that fragment down had either expected the rest to be obvious or had been interrupted before finishing. The card was lowered to the bench and angled toward the light from the window. That brought out the pressure of the writing, but also something else, more ghostly than graphite. Pressed flat within the fold was the faint transfer from another paper that had once lain against it. The writing was reversed, borrowed only by pressure. A few letters could be made out after a patient squint. Ward. Below them, a partial number string ending in 16. The marks were too regular to be idle scribble. They belonged to another sort of record, one with lines or fields or at least a steadier structure than a note dashed off to oneself. The impression did not tell enough to stand alone, though it told just enough to suggest contact with some forwarding or postal paper. The card had lain against such a slip long enough to borrow its shape, not long enough to keep the paper itself. That raised a question the card would not yet answer. Why copy from the larger paper at all? The pencil marks inside had their own order, and that order did not match the outside purpose of the card. It asked to be examined piece by piece. One corner held another broken line. The words hold until were clear enough, then the stroke lifted and the fold cut through where the rest would have been. The phrase sat uneasily beside the repeated time and the line about the chime. It did not sound like collection. It sounded like handling, something to be kept back, then released. A parcel, perhaps, a letter. The thought reached, almost at once, toward the stopped small traveling clock that had already tugged several loose threads into this shop. If something had been held, could it have been that? The card offered no answer. It only widened the shape of the question. The blank side, where names for ordinary collection would usually have run in a neat, practical order, held a rubbed-away line. The erasure had been patient. Not harsh enough to roughen the stock, not sloppy enough to leave a cloud of graphite, just enough to soften nearly all of a word and the dash after it. What remained was only Riv. Place, route, destination, hold point, any of those might fit there. None could yet be chosen. The care of the erasure mattered more than the fragment itself. Whoever had left the timing and the handling marks legible had made a quieter effort to dim where the item was meant to go next. A mark in the margin had looked, at first glance, like a tally. Turned a little toward the light, it proved to be something more exact. A tiny boxed F. Another sat beside the line about the chime. The two marks matched one another too neatly to be accidental. Their shape had a procedural air, the sort of shorthand that belonged to repeated use. If one had been copied, both likely had. The little boxes nudged the whole object farther away from private message and closer to a system of forwarding, holding, passing along. Then, as the fold was opened fully and the crease widened, a dusting rose so lightly it might have been missed if the window had not caught it. Flower. Only a trace, pale and soft, lodged in the fold rather than smeared across the surface. It had hidden in the crease where fingers would not brush it away. The amount was too slight to declare anything by itself. Yet it joined the card's bakery origin to the practical world of wrapped parcels and paper goods, where fine dust could settle into corners and stay there unnoticed through a morning's handling. The card lay flat now, and the bench around it seemed to arrange itself in relation to this new center. The shelf list remained where it was. The test watch gave a resumed tick in a small, stubborn voice. The knife still waited on the cloth, unused. A basket touched wood before any greeting did. Its base met the bench with care. No rattle, only the soft settling sound of weight distributed among wrapped parcels. Warmth came with it, and the faintly yeasted smell of the morning's remaining rounds, gentled now by paper and cooling crust. Elias's hand left the handle and hovered a moment as his eyes went not to the quiet wall, as they often might have, but directly to the card spread open under the window light. He reached for the fold before the writing. That small choice suited him. Saved paper habit showed in it at once, an instinct for stock and wear and reuse before words had their say. Fingers touched the edge, turned it once, and tested the thickness between thumb and forefinger. "That one's from Lark and Loaf," he said, already certain from touch. "Bakery collection stock. We use the same cut for held orders, too." The card came a little closer to him, angled to catch more light. He looked over the outside first, where the ordinary details remained, then the inside where they did not. The basket beside him breathed out one more mild thread of warmth from the wrapped parcels as he studied the folds. If someone was filing carefully at home, they'd have chosen cleaner paper. His fingertip tapped the inner crease, nowhere near the writing itself. A counterhand would reuse this, quickly, whatever was nearest. The distinction settled neatly into place, not random reuse, and not the sort of private keeping one did in a drawer. Counter work, something passed, held, copied, then moved on. The door opened again after a little while, bringing with it the clean tang of river air, and the sight of a damp cuff darkened at the edge. Gideon paused just inside with route habit still on him, as though his body had not entirely left the path that had brought him here. What he carried was practical enough to explain the stop before any words did. An errand folded into the day, a reason to come by the corner where repairs and timings were sorted. His glance went first to the bench and the spread of paper there, then to the faces turned toward it, and only after that to the usual question. "No repair waiting on me, I hope." The line was offered lightly, though his eyes had already found the reversed impression on the card where it lay nearest the window. He came near enough to look without crowding the bench, river air and damp wool following him in a narrow wake. "That ending," he said after a moment, touching nothing. "Ward. I've seen that on forwarding slips tied to goods moving on from one stop to another. No more than that." He left the rest where it belonged, with the paper and the hands already over it. Yet the practical note held. The collection card was laid beside the written list from the shelf. The pencil came back into Rowan's hand, though not to write yet. Instead, the eye moved line by line between the two records, comparing the newly found card with what had already been noted from the folded letter. There it was again in the earlier list, 8:16, corrected twice. Here on the card, the same corrected time survived in another hand, or perhaps another stage of the same handling. Two separate records preserving that same corrected time changed its weight. A single correction might be no more than a mistake remembered. A copied correction meant the corrected form itself had mattered enough to travel. The point was spoken aloud in a quiet, practical way, less conclusion than placement. If it was only noticed once, it could have stayed where it began. If it was copied with the correction kept, someone needed the corrected time afterward. The card shifted under the fingers as attention returned to the flower in the fold. A thumb passed gently over the crease and came away with almost nothing to show, only the softest pale dust on the skin. It rubbed smooth at once, dry and fine. Elias watched that small test and answered from the world he knew better than either of the others. That settles around wrapped parcels, he said. Counter dust, not from dough work. Dough clings heavier, and there'd be grease if it had sat near certain trays. His hand indicated the basket, the parcels within, the paper and string, an ordinary movement of goods through a bakery morning. This card was near labeling, holding, passing along. The unfinished fragment lower on the inside fold waited until there was room to look at it properly. The eye had passed over Baj's stem once already. Now it returned with the old question close behind it. The missing, winding stem. The little traveling clock had brought that absence with it from the start, a practical lack with larger consequences. Set beside that known absence, the fragment altered shape. The room's sounds did not stop. They arranged themselves more narrowly. The testing corner kept its low ticking. A wrapped parcel in the basket gave a faint paper sigh as it settled. No one spoke for a breath or two. Then the thought came clear enough to say, "It may belong to the clock itself." The fragment was traced in air rather than on the paper. If the original note had contained an instruction about the stem, replace stem, missing stem, hold for stem, any number of useful forms, then the copied fragment might preserve only the part needed by the handler. Someone passing the item along would not require the whole sentence if the key word did the work. The line about the chime, the repeated time, the hold instruction, the forwarding trace, all of it leaned a little farther away from private phrasing and toward repair-related handling that had happened somewhere outside this bench. Gideon looked from the fragment to the little boxed marks. That fits the F as well, if it means what I've seen it mean. He bent a little closer, enough to be sure of the shape. Sometimes a mark like that goes on something not delivered at the first stop, sent onward. His contribution ended there, as though he knew the exact edge of his own part in the matter and would not step over it. The observation steadied what the card was becoming. Not a hidden message tucked away for secrecy. A working paper built to keep an object moving through hands and places. The rubbed line with rib drew attention again after that. It sat where a destination or route note would naturally be written on a card meant for handling. The temptation to force it into a known place name was left alone. Where had more to say than theory did. The erasure had not struck at the timing. It had not tried to remove the boxed marks. It had gone after where, not when. That narrow fact was enough to keep. The phrase beginning with hold until was measured against the line about the chime. Elias leaned one forearm lightly against the bench and considered the spacing, the folds, the way one note sat apart from the other. They may not belong to the same sentence at all, he said. One could be storage, the other release. He glanced at the parcels in the basket, where held orders and collection notes had their own ordinary logic. If someone had to remember both, that would explain copying them onto whatever card was at hand. Storage and release. Keep back, then send on. The card had begun as a puzzle of phrases. It was becoming a process. The reversed number string ending in 16 was checked against the shelf list, against likely collection counts, against dates that might have made sense in ordinary record keeping. None sat as neatly as the repeated time. The number's orderliness still suggested a larger slip, something with its own system beyond this card. If that was so, then only enough had been borrowed to keep an item moving. The whole of the original paper had not needed to stay with the card, or perhaps could not. The stock was turned toward the light again, this time with more purpose. Pressure marks often told their own quiet history if given patience. The card flexed slightly between finger and thumb, while the window brought up shallow ridges and troughs in the paper. WS near the top had a different depth to it. Those initials had been written earlier, with less force and a calmer hand. The timing notes pressed deeper, firmer, later. The card was tilted left, then right. The initials remained the oldest layer visible there. The later hand had written around them rather than over them, using the available space below and beside. What had seemed at first like one note composed in a single sitting now separated into stages. A source, stop, or person marked first by those initials. Handling instructions added after. The card had not been born all at once. It had accumulated purpose. WS may be where it started, Rowan said, though the words were offered as a narrow possibility rather than a claim. Or who had it before the timing mattered? The others followed the pressure marks with their eyes, each seeing the same shallow evidence. The bench held two earlier pieces nearby, the folded letter and the old torn fragment. They were brought close and set in one practical line with the collection card. 3 scraps, 3 different bodies of paper, 3 different kinds of incompleteness. Yet seen together, they began to align. Here was the forwarding trace borrowed into the card by pressure. Ward, and the partial number ending in 16. Here was the corrected time surviving in more than one place. 816, altered and kept. Here was the unfinished note about bet stem, no longer floating free as a stray syllable, but sitting beside the known absence of the winding stem from the small traveling clock. Shared handling rose stronger than shared authorship. The papers no longer needed to have been written by the same person to belong to the same chain. What mattered was that an object, or perhaps a parcel containing an object, had moved through hands that copied only what was necessary each time. The question shifted away from who wrote every mark and toward who had moved the thing along, who needed these fragments to do practical work, who erased destination while preserving timing. The ledger itself, so ordinary in all this, offered one more check simply by being what it was. Elias looked at where the card had been found beneath it and gave the sort of explanation that comes from long use rather than deduction. A collection card gets tucked under a ledger when someone needs it only briefly, he said. Balancing names, holds, pickups. You keep it from sliding off, then the larger paper goes away and the smaller one stays. That made the hiding place smaller and more human. No dramatic concealment. A card left behind after use when the paper it had copied from was taken elsewhere. The bench had not discovered a secret cache. It had uncovered an accident of process. The pencil returned to the fresh written list on the shelf. The point touched down with greater steadiness now, because the conclusion could be narrowed without pretending to finish the matter. A new line was added in compact script. Secondary record likely used during forwarding or hold process. The words did useful work. They settled one question: why a deliberate second record might have been needed while opening another pair in its place. WS no longer looked decorative. Riv no longer looked incidental. Both stood more like coordinates in a system not yet fully seen. The collection card was unfolded once more, this time only to make a complete copy of what still survived. Every word and mark that could be read was transferred to the page. The broken hold instruction, the line about the chime, each tiny boxed F, the fragment ending in stem, the initials, the partial place note, the reverse trace and number, as best they could be rendered. Where the missing parts belonged, blank spaces were left. No guess filled them. The gaps remained practical, waiting for process rather than imagination. Beside the copied notes, the pencil paused. The testing clocks continued in their patient measures. One from the corner ran a little fast against another, making a soft, uneven braid of sound that would have bothered no one except the person who had set them there to be heard. Elias rested a hand on the basket handle and looked from the flower in the fold to the wrapped parcels he had brought. I can check old collection habits at Larkin Loaf, he said. See whether boxed marks like that were ever used there, or whether a card might have passed through with held items from somewhere else. It was the kind of next step that fit the chapter of work they had reached. Sensible, close to hand, widening the path only by what could actually be checked. No flourish, no leap. Gideon gave a small nod, still carrying the day's route in the set of his shoulders. Goods sent onward gather little systems around them, he said. More than things delivered once. That, too, was enough. He had brought the river air in with him and a practical shape for the clue, and now that shape could remain after he went. Before the card was put down again, the case-opening knife was finally lifted from the polishing cloth. The handle had kept a slight warmth from the room. It was moved aside so the cloth could be cleared, leaving a clean place for the folded stock to rest without picking up fresh impressions or scratches. The card was laid there carefully, its edges aligned with the weave of the cloth, the way one sets down something that has become evidence through use rather than drama. The bench looked more orderly after that small act, though no less full of work. The ledger stood open to its place. The copied notes waited on the shelf list. The older scraps remained nearby in their line of relation. The basket of parcels gave off only the faintest remnant of warm bread now, nearly merged with paper and room air. At the edge of the space, the test watch that had been wound by habit earlier kept on with its resumed ticking, as if pleased simply to have answered. Around them, the quiet wall returned to its patient measure. Chapter 4. The rinsing water in the little sink had already lost its clearness, holding a faint gray cast now, the sort that came after metal dust, old oil, and soap had all agreed to share the same shallow basin for a while. One cloth lay soaking against the side. Another had been folded and set aside. The last one twisted between careful hands, water threading down in a thin rope before breaking into drops. Near the sink, kept just clear of the damp by the raised lip of a tin edge, the bakery collection card stood propped to dry. Its paper had softened a little at one corner from earlier handling, then stiffened again as the wet left it. The copied time remained plain, 8:16. So did the unfinished handling line that had stayed with him since he had written it down, more persistent than the soap on the air, more lasting than the coolness of the water on his fingers. The cloth was wrung once more, then folded into a square with the neat economy of long habit. Bench work gathered itself back into order in small ways. Damp things belonged together. Dry things kept their place. The card stayed where it was, close enough to be taken along, far enough from the sink to preserve what had been copied onto it. The case-opening knife had been left on the polishing cloth as if it had wandered there by accident. It had not. The hand reaching for it remembered, before the fingers closed around the handle, why it had been set aside. A parcel box had come in unopened. It had been meant for attention before the walk onto Larkin Loaf, and the ordinary drift from one small task into another bent quietly toward that waiting package. The blade lifted with a soft click from the cloth. A thumb passed over the edge in an old, exact test, less to judge sharpness than to greet the tool properly before use. Paper and twine asked for different pressure than brass, but the principle held. Resistance told its own story if approached cleanly. The parcel box sat where it had been left, modest enough in size to seem easy company on a crowded bench. Twine crossed it in practical lines. The paper had the faint nap that catches at dry skin. He steadied it with one hand and slipped the knife under the seam with the other, working by feel more than sight, finding the give where paste had dried and the firmer place where it still held. The movement resembled the opening of a stubborn watch back, only quieter. No pry, no tear, no haste. A little pressure, a slight turn of the wrist. Then the seam yielded, the twine loosened, the paper lifted. Inside, the packing seemed to promise more than it delivered. A nest of paper had been drawn inward around a space shaped for something round and small. The hollow announced itself before the contents did. It held the memory of one object while another sat awkwardly in its place. What sat in the box was the wrong repair. It was too broad through the middle for the narrow cradle beneath it. One edge rode above the folds instead of settling between them, and the lid could not have closed without pressing against the case. Rowan lifted it free and set it on the polishing cloth. The paper beneath relaxed only slightly. Its trained shape remained. The box had been prepared with care for something smaller. The lid opened farther, and a pencil note came into view on the inner panel near the fold. The first writing had been rubbed thin, then traced again with firmer pressure until the instruction remained clear. Hold until 8:16. Below it sat two tiny boxed F marks, one near the note and another lower down. Their squared borders had been drawn slowly and evenly. Repeated in the same lid, they carried the look of marks borrowed from some system of sorting or forwarding. Rowan tipped the box toward the bench lamp. The second one cut deeper into the paper. The 6 closed tightly at the top. He had seen those small habits already on the bakery collection card, though he left the comparison for later and kept his attention on what the parcel itself could tell him. Beneath the lining lay a torn label stub, tucked so flat that only the disturbed cradle had exposed its edge. He freed it with the nail of one finger and drew it out without adding a fresh crease. At one end, the letters WS remained. In the middle, a place name had been scraped almost to fibers, leaving only Riv. Across the reverse, pressed through from earlier writing, the tail of another phrase showed at an angle. Ward 16. The scraping had been deliberate. The string hole, by contrast, was clean and centered, evidence that the label had once been tied properly to something before its destination was removed. Rowan set the stub beside the open box. It had not begun as a loose scrap. It had belonged to another parcel or object and had traveled here afterward. A second note waited in the packing itself. Copying pencil had bled softly into the fibers, but one phrase remained readable. before the last chime. Beside it, the end of another word survived: stem. The box held three kinds of information now: an instruction tied to 816, handling marks repeated in little squares, and fragments that pointed toward a small mechanical piece. Rowan pressed lightly beneath the paper cradle. A narrow body had rested there. On one side, a short protruding point had left a small push in the fold. Before he could examine it further, the bell above the front door rang once. He laid a clean sheet of tissue across the open parcel, enough to protect the loose papers without hiding where they had been found, and turned toward the counter. A customer came in, carrying an empty padded case beneath one arm. The case was long enough for a mantel clock and worn smooth at the handle from years of careful use. "I believe you have mine ready," the customer said, setting the case down. Rowan crossed to the shelf behind the counter and lifted a walnut mantel clock from the place where completed work waited. Cleaning had lifted the dust and old wax while leaving the years visible. Fine scratches remained along the base, and the brass bezel held the soft shine of long handling. "The movement was sound," he said. Old oil had thickened around the strike work. It needed cleaning more than replacing. The customer touched one finger to the edge of the case, then drew the hand back before leaving a mark on the glass. "Will it sound properly now?" Rowan set the clock on the counter and advanced the minute hand with measured turns. Inside, the mechanism gathered itself. A moment later, two low notes sounded, warm and rounded, the second settling into the room just after the first had faded. The customer smiled without looking away from the clock. "That is how I remember it." A pale mark crossed one corner of the walnut case where something had struck it years ago. The customer rested a fingertip beside the mark. "You left this. It belonged to the case before it came to me. I was hoping you would." The fingertip moved away. "Someone once tried to polish it out. They only made the wood around it brighter." Rowan let the clock run another few beats before stopping the test. "The mark is shallow. It will not trouble the movement. That is not why I wanted it left." He inclined his head once. The clock had already answered the rest. "It may gain a minute during the first day," he said. "If it does, leave it running. The movement will settle after the cleaning." While he fitted the clock into its padded case, the customer's attention moved to a narrow shelf near the front window. A small cream-faced bedside clock stood there in a brushed brass case, plain except for a dark blue line around the dial. Beside it waited another of similar size in dark wood, its face rounder and its numerals larger. "That one is new, isn't it?" "New to the shop." The customer lifted the brass clock after Rowan nodded permission. It sat neatly in one hand. Two winding knobs and a setting stem projected from the back, small enough to overlook until the clock was turned. "It is for a guest room," the customer said. "The clock there has a bell loud enough to wake the house." Rowan brought the dark wooden clock down as well and placed both on a square of felt. The wooden one kept a broader tick, easy to hear from the counter. The brass clock made a finer sound that disappeared sooner into the many measures around it. The wooden one has the larger face, he said. The brass one is quieter. The customer leaned closer and closed their eyes for a few seconds. The two little clocks ran side by side, one steady and open, the other almost private. And the alarms? Rowan turned the wooden clock first. Its bell gave a bright, decisive burst, the customer's shoulders before the sound had finished. That would wake the house, too. The brass clock answered next with a brief, contained trill, more persistent than sharp. Its alarm stopped cleanly when Rowan released the small lever at the back. The customer smiled. That one asks instead of insisting. It still expects an answer. That is fair. Rowan showed how the setting stem moved the alarm hand separately from the time. The customer tried it once, turning too far, then easing it back until the small marker rested at 7. It feels more delicate than it looks, only at the stem. The case will tolerate ordinary use. The customer returned the wooden clock to the felt and kept the brass one. I'll take this one as well. Rowan chose a shallow box from beneath the counter and lined it with cream tissue. Before lowering the clock into place, he turned the winding knobs inward and laid a narrow fold across the setting stem. Without that small protection, the stem would press a point into the wrapping and take the first knock meant for the case. He settled the clock into the tissue, drew the sides close, and added one final fold so the shape could not shift. The paper learned the object quickly. Narrow body, raised center, one guarded point at the side. The resemblance reached him before the parcel box came back into view. He tied the purchase, wrote the receipt, and returned the repaired mantel clock to its case. The customer left carrying the older clock in one hand and the new one tucked beneath the other arm. At the door, the bell gave a lighter answer than the mantel clock had, then fell still. Rowan remained behind the counter for a moment, looking at the empty square of tissue where the bedside clock had stood. The space appeared again in the front window, a pale gap between the dark wooden clock and a nickel travel clock with a folding handle. From the street, the gap would show first. The surrounding pieces leaned toward it without moving, their careful spacing broken by the absence of the brass case. Rowan carried the square of felt to the window and lifted the two neighboring clocks away. A clean outline marked each place on the ledge. Dust had gathered everywhere else in a film fine enough to brighten under the glass. He wiped the open section, then continued along the full length until the wood showed the same low sheen from one end to the other. A cupboard in the back room held 3 clocks that had arrived late the previous week and had yet to reach the display. He returned with the largest wrapped in a length of soft gray cloth. When the folds opened, a carriage clock stood in his hands. Deep green leather covered the case, darkened at the corners where the brass mounts curved around it. The dial was cream enamel, the numerals slender and black, with a small moon-shaped window set above the 6. A beveled glass panel at the top revealed the steady movement of the escapement. He wound it only enough to bring the mechanism awake. The balance began to move beneath the glass, catching one thin flash from the window with every turn. Its tick carried farther than the brass bedside clock had, though the leather case softened the edges of the sound. The carriage clock took the open place first. Rowan stepped back to the center of the shop and studied the window from there. Its height drew too much weight to one side. He shifted the nickel travel clock farther along, brought a low round alarm clock forward, and placed a narrow silver clock behind it so that only the upper half of its dial showed. The green case remained visible between them, framed by smaller faces instead of standing apart. One price card had curled at the corner. He replaced it with a fresh square of cream stock and wrote the amount beneath the clock's description in small, upright figures. The ink dried while he wound the nickel clock and corrected the alarm clock by half a minute. He checked each face against the regulator on the wall, then turned the green carriage clock a fraction toward the street. Light moved along its beveled glass and settled at the brass handle. He opened the door and stepped onto the pavement. Through the front glass, the display rose gently toward the carriage clock and lowered again across the smaller pieces. The green leather case held the eye for a moment before the neighboring faces drew it along the ledge. Back inside, he found that the work had taken the better part of an hour. Coffee from the pot behind the bench had gone dark and cool, and a small ache had gathered between Rowan's shoulders from bending over the window. He turned the sign on the door to back shortly, took his coat from the peg, and stepped outside. Lark and Loaf stood close enough that the bakery windows came into view before the shop key had warmed in his pocket. The morning rush had thinned. Inside, cooling racks stood behind the counter with open spaces between the remaining loaves. A tray near the glass held 6 croissants, their layered tops browned deeply at the ridges and pale where the folds opened. Rowan ordered coffee and 1 croissant. The cup warmed both hands while the pastry was slipped into a small paper sleeve. Butter and roasted coffee followed him back into the street, mingling for a few steps with salt air moving up from the harbor. When he returned, the clocks met him through the glass in their new arrangement. The green carriage clock had advanced cleanly. Its balance still flashed beneath the top panel, steady in the place he had chosen for it. He locked the door behind him, turned the sign, and carried the coffee and croissant to the bench. A plate kept flakes from the work surface. The first piece broke away along one of the baked seams, leaving a scatter of thin, golden layers against the white china. He ate slowly while the parcel box waited under its clean sheet of tissue. By the time the cup was half empty, the warmth had loosened the pull across his shoulders. He folded the paper sleeve, moved the plate beyond the lamp, and returned to the bench. The clean sheet lifted from the parcel. He pressed once more beneath the paper cradle, this time with the memory of the wrapping still in his hands. The narrow body, raised center, and short side impression matched the marks a compact clock could leave when paper was folded carefully around its winding parts. The fragment ending in apt stem settled closer to meaning. The fit was practical and worth carrying forward. He brought the bakery collection card from beside the sink and laid it near the writing inside the lid. The copied time matched in more than number. The deeper second one and tightly closed 6 appeared in both places. Either one instruction had been copied from the other, or the same hand had copied both from a source that was no longer present. In either case, the card and the parcel belonged to the same line of handling. The boxed F marks appeared on both as well. Repetition turned them from oddity into procedure. Rowan did not yet know whether the marks began at Larkin Loaf or arrived there from somewhere farther along the route, but they gave him a clear question to carry to the bakery. The torn label stub came next. Its clean string hole did not agree with the twine marks around the parcel box. The distances were wrong. The stub had once hung from a narrower tie. Whatever WS and Riv had named, the label had not started its journey on this box. He angled the reverse toward the lamp. The press-through ending remained uncertain, except for Ward 16. The number might belong to an address, a route, or some internal handling note. It did not need an answer yet. It needed preserving. The scraped place on the stub resembled the erased destination on the bakery collection card in width and intent. In both, the beginning had been left just readable enough to suggest Riv. Everything that would have completed the destination had been removed. The time had been kept. The place had not. That was a pattern, not where. Rowan turned to the repair he had lifted from the box. Until now, its wrongness had been measured by shape. The label attached to it offered a different kind of evidence. Along the seam, fine dust had settled during storage. The string crossed that dust too cleanly, interrupting it with a newer line. The label had been tied on after the box had already been sitting somewhere for a while. The repair had not simply been packed badly. It had been renamed after the fact. He loosened the knot without cutting it, easing each turn free in the order it had been made. The string relaxed. The label came away with its bends intact, carrying the recent history of how it had been attached. Beneath it, the broad repair returned to its plain role as the object used to complete a substitution. On the bench, Rowan placed the evidence in a simple order. The parcel box came first, holding the shape of the missing object. Beside it lay the bakery collection card and the lid with their matching 816 and boxed F marks. The torn stub followed, carrying WS, Riv, and the faint reversed ending. Last came the loosened label from the wrong repair, newer than the dust beneath it. The arrangement held. A compact mechanical object had been packed in the box, something close in scale to a small clock and likely fitted with a stem at one side. Instructions had traveled with it. Hold until 8:16 before the last chime. Its destination had been partly erased. A label from elsewhere had been hidden beneath the lining, while another had been attached later to a repair that did not fit the box at all. What remained uncertain was where the exchange had happened and who had expected the boxed F marks to be understood. Those questions belonged beyond the bench. The bakery collection card was slipped together with the torn label stub so the two could travel as one. Rowan placed the loosened label between them, preserving its folds, and left the parcel box open where the trained cradle could be examined again if needed. The case opening knife returned to the polishing cloth. Its blade was wiped once along a clean fold and set exactly where it could be found again. Gray water waited in the sink. The shop resumed its layered ticking around the completed repair shelf and the empty place where the bedside clock had stood. He gathered the papers and slipped them into the inner pocket of his coat. The next time he crossed to Larkin Loaf, the collection card, the torn stub, and the loosened label would go with him. Chapter 5. One careful hand kept the bakery collection card, the torn parcel label stub, and the loosened intact parcel label from lifting in the river air, while the other reached for the storage chest lid. The rail still held a little damp from earlier weather, cool through the heel of the hand, and the cloths left to air beside the gloves breathed out a faint, clean smell of rainwater and soap. When the lid came up, the hinges gave their small metal complaint, thin and familiar, and the breath from inside the chest rose at once. Old wood, machine oil, a little iron, the dry dust of things kept because one day they might answer a need no one could name in advance. The search for a spare gear had begun before the papers were set out, and continued now only because hands already in motion prefer to finish what they have started. Small wrapped bits and loose pieces shifted in the chest with muted clicks. A gear was found by touch before sight, lifted from among washers and screws, rubbed clean on the edge of a sleeve, and held near the rail where the light could catch its teeth. The remembered size of the missing piece lived more in finger memory than in measure. The breadth across the center, the spacing of the teeth, the slight weight expected from a part meant to turn smoothly within another. This one failed almost at once. Too broad at the rim, one tooth too many by the count taken with a thumbnail, and a center hole that would never seat properly where it needed to go. It was set aside on the chest edge, useful perhaps on another day, useless to the present trouble. The weather notes lay near the rail where they had been left to take the air, practical pages with their corners softened by handling and their surfaces marked by river habit rather than mystery. Their place there made sense. The edge peeking from beneath them did not. A folded letter showed itself in a narrow pale strip where no letter ought to be, tucked with a deliberateness that stood apart from the loose, ordinary untidiness of papers set down in work and left for a little while. Before any page was touched, the enamel mug ringed from old tea was nudged farther back from the rail. The movement was small and practiced. A thumb against the handle, a careful slide over the boards, enough distance to spare any paper from a fresh mark or a wet catch at the base. The brown ring around the mug's lip had long ago become part of its look, but the tea inside still held a little warmth. The mug settled with a faint ceramic sound. Then there was the pause that belonged to delicate things. The same pause used before fitting a tiny part into a tight place settled over the papers now. Where had the folded letter been found exactly? Under which edge? How deeply tucked? Had the weather notes simply drifted over it in a breeze, or had someone placed one beneath the other with intention and left them so? The hand that had searched the chest moved instead to the stack on the rail, not touching yet, only marking the arrangement with the eye. The weather notes were lifted first. Their top page came up with the dry whisper of paper against paper. Underneath, another page. Under that, the fold. The letter did not cling or drag upward as if damp had married the surfaces together. It lay there with a slight resistance, only at the point where the weather notes had rested over it for more than a single passing hour. Enough to keep it in place through a morning or two. Enough for edges to learn each other's shape without truly fastening. The resistance made itself known in a soft catch and release when the folded letter came free. Its wrongness was immediate. Weather notes belonged to river air, to practical record, to the ordinary discipline of looking out and writing down what the day had done. A folded letter hidden under them on the porch rail belonged to none of that. The place itself argued against accident. If something had been mislaid in haste, it would more likely have gone into a pocket, under the mug, into the chest, between pages indoors. Here, on the rail, under weather notes that lived by routine, the letter looked less forgotten than left. The notes were checked before the fold was opened. Each page was turned enough to see whether one had somehow been used to wrap the other, whether some absent-minded tucking had occurred after a damp morning and before tea. The dates, the marks, the little practical notations all followed their own plain order. No gap invited a letter. No line referred to one. Nothing about the arrangement belonged to cabin routine. That mismatch worked steadily, like a hand on a latch, turning curiosity away from simple misfiling and toward the thought that the fold had been slipped there to wait until the right eyes came to it. The paper itself had a different body from the weather notes. It was firmer, less worn, folded with care along one line and then flattened again under other papers until the crease had deepened. The outer surface showed no name, address, or visible mark until it was opened. A thumb rested at the fold, feeling where the paper had been bent and bent again. There was no tear there, only pressure. The edge had sat long enough beneath the notes to hold flat, though not long enough to frill with damp. The fold opened. Inside, the writing did not present itself all at once. Some lines lay partly obscured by the crease and some by the angle of light, and the eye caught first on what it already knew enough to fear. 8:16. The exact time sat in the body of the letter where it belonged to the sentence around it, and then again in the margin, written separately as if corrected there or emphasized after the rest had been set down. The repeated minute made the page sharpen under attention. It was the same troublesome time already threading through the parcel trail, and seeing it here gave the number a new sort of weight. A remembered time might be written once and left alone. A practical time, one that mattered to a process, often called itself back to the margin when someone wanted no mistake. The body around it was not immediately enough to explain. The eye moved over neighboring words, over the pressure of the pen, over the little gap where the margin note had been fitted in. The second 816 sat slightly apart, darker at the first figure where the pen had touched down with decision. It did not look decorative. It looked necessary. Below that, in shorter writing and with a different pressure, came the phrase, "Hold if after." The words were brief enough to seem almost stingy. No destination followed. No name. No place where the held thing should go. No person to whom it belonged. No reason given for the hold. The pressure changed from the line above, lighter in one stroke and then abruptly firmer in another, as if written by a different hand or by the same hand at a different surface and speed. Something was to happen before or after 816. If after, hold. Hold what? For whom? At what point in a chain? The paper shifted slightly in the breeze from the river, and the fold had to be steadied against the rail. The hand flattened it gently, fingertips splayed so as not to cover the words. The body of the writing offered fragments rather than comfort. There was enough to know this was no household reminder and too little to know what task it belonged to. Another line waited lower down, interrupted where the fold crossed it. The sentence did not break from tearing. The paper was whole. Yet the fold itself had hidden part of the line so that what could be clearly read was this: before the last chime, check side stem. The eye returned to it more than once, trying to decide whether the missing sense lived in the blank before stem or in the phrase before it. The dash before stem looked like the surviving tail of a longer word caught on the wrong side of a fold or lost in cramped writing. Side was plain enough. Stem was plain enough. Together, they were not plain at all. A side stem, the stem at the side. Check side stem. The line echoed the earlier practical language without opening it. Before the last chime suggested timing. Check suggested handling. Stem suggested a part. Yet no object was named. A finger traced the fold without pressing. The break came exactly there, where paper bent and the line had settled into shadow over time. There was no missing scrap to restore. The sentence remained intact and stubbornly incomplete in meaning. Stem might belong to something small and fitted, some piece easy to overlook unless one knew to look. It might belong to a clock-like object, to a winding part, to a handled item with a narrow side piece. It might be shorthand used by someone who needed only enough words to remind themselves what to inspect. On the page alone, it would not say. Near the bottom, where the lines loosened and the writing grew more administrative than message-like, two boxed F marks appeared. They did not sit in the same hand as the rest. One was firm and square, drawn with the compact certainty of someone accustomed to marking papers for movement. The other was lighter, a little less committed at one corner, as though copied later from an earlier note rather than made fresh from thought. The boxes mattered as much as the letters inside them. A plain F might be incidental. A boxed F belonged to sorting, to designation, to a system somebody expected others to recognize. Beside them sat the phrase Ward 16. Again, no anchor word, no street, no room, no route. Nothing to tell whether Ward 16 named a place to send something, a place to keep it, a place from which it had come, or a place copied from some larger original and left stranded here. The phrase sat there in the same unsatisfying way the time did, exact and yet unsupported. And because the bakery collection card and the parcel labels had already raised the possibility of relabeling, repeated handling, and a trail that had passed through more than one set of practical hands, the boxed F marks deepened that sense rather than clearing it. The folded letter looked less like a private note than a survivor from a working stack. The porch boards gave a familiar answer to approaching steps before any voice came. Along with the footfalls came the dry rustle of carried paper, a sound different from cloth and different from parcels. And by the time Edith reached the rail, she already had a bundle tucked under one arm and practical attention fixed on what had been laid out in order. Her arrival fit the errand already underway. The bakery collection card and the parcel labels had been meant to travel onward with her help, or at least under her eye, and the sight of the folded letter among them changed that purpose before she had fully set her bundle down. She placed what she carried on the porch bench with care enough to keep corners from bending. The paper in her bundle whispered and settled. Her coat still held the outside air. A few loose strands had escaped whatever had kept her hair back during the walk, and one cuff bore a faint smudge from ordinary work. Nothing in her manner rushed ahead to the mystery itself. The first glance went to the grouping on the rail, the card, the stub, the loosened label, the damp cloths nearby, the weather notes displaced from their place, taking in relation before content. "The errand has grown," she said. The folded letter was shown where it had been found before it was passed over. The hand indicating it hovered above the weather notes now lying to one side, then above the strip of rail they had covered. Edith's attention followed the path rather than the words. She looked at the practical arrangement first. What had been under what had lain protected from damp, what had been moved, and what had not. That glance alone explained why she belonged here now. Some people read a page and begin at the writing. She read a trail of handling before she read intent. Only after the place had been established did she take the letter. Her fingers held it by the edges, as if the paper might still have one more useful thing to say through its surfaces. The weather notes were lifted again, this time with both sets of eyes on their undersides. If the folded letter had come to rest there by accident, there might have been some sign of damp transfer, a faint sticking line, grit caught between pages, a rubbed patch where the papers had shifted together. The notes separated cleanly. Their undersides were marked only by the ordinary life of pages left near weather and touched by working hands. No grit, no tide line, no accidental paste of moisture. The folded letter had not ridden there by chance. That answer sent attention to the rail itself. Fingers traced the boards where the stack had rested. The wood carried two stories at once, a darker damp on either side where the morning air had settled, and a drier strip beneath the papers where they had shielded it. The protected patch was narrow and distinct. It showed that the folded letter and the pages above it had sat long enough to keep off a little moisture, enough for the rail to remember their shape, though not so long that the letter's edges had softened or begun to curl. The paper still held its firmness. The corners still lay sharp. Recent placement, then, though not a moment ago. A window measured in part of a day, perhaps more than one ordinary morning, though not many. The chest remained open at their side, its breath of oil and wood still rising whenever the air shifted. The spare gear on its edge caught Edith's eye only briefly before the papers reclaimed it. All four paper pieces were brought into line along the rail. The bakery collection card, the torn parcel label stub, the loosened intact parcel label, and the folded letter spread enough to show the lower portion where the boxed F marks sat. The arrangement took a little adjusting. One needed to be turned to the light. Another had to be held flat at a corner. The rail became, for a few moments, a narrow desk laid over with a very small archive. The comparison of the boxed F marks did not yield a simple triumph. One could not point and say, here was proof, here was one hand and one source, and a chain made visible at last. The shapes were close, though. The boxes had a similar practical squareness, drawn for use rather than ornament. The F itself in each had the same habit of a short top bar and a longer middle one, though pressure varied, and one corner on the folded letter's lighter mark had a hesitating quality absent in the firmer examples. Enough resemblance gathered there to suggest kinship in handling. The folded letter did not belong to cabin life. It belonged with these papers, or near enough to them to have moved through the same sort of hands. Edith bent closer, one fingertip hovering beside the lower note on the folded page. This line, she said, indicating the shorter pressure. That is office language. The phrase she meant was the brief instruction about holding after a certain point. Her explanation came in the plain terms of routine rather than theory. A hold might follow a failed delivery. It might follow a forwarding request. It might be used when a destination had gone uncertain and someone decided the item should wait rather than be sent on in error. She spoke as someone naming drawers in a work table, each with its proper use. None of those possibilities settled which had happened here. All of them tied the folded letter more cleanly to the same forwarding or hold process, already circling 816. People write less when the system is understood, she said. If the rest would be obvious to the next pair of hands, they leave only the hinge of it. The repeated time drew them back. The question shifted from what the number might symbolize to what work it might do. A pickup cutoff? A sorting minute? The moment a chime sounded. The recorded time something had been set aside. Each possibility had to be held against the evidence of the writing itself. Because the time appeared twice, and because the margin version looked like correction or emphasis rather than idle repetition, memory seemed a poor fit. People remembering write loosely, people instructing write again to prevent error. Would you note a collection that way? Came the quiet question. Only if 1 minute mattered, Edith said. A vanishingly small difference can matter in a chain, before a bag closes, before a route changes, before a clerk marks something undeliverable for the day, before a bell, if a bell governs the work. Bell. Chime. The page offered that word elsewhere, and now the practical possibilities began to lean toward one another. The phrase about the last chime was spoken aloud once, softly, with the paper between them and the rail under their hands. Heard in the air rather than seen on the page, it lost what little poetry the eye might have tried to lend it. Spoken beside the bakery collection card and the parcel labels, it sounded like a note for timing a handoff against a known sound. A thing to be checked before the final signal in some routine. The storage chest, still open, offered its own prompt. The spare gear was picked up again, turned between finger and thumb, and used as a way of testing the vocabulary of STEM against known parts. Teeth clicked faintly against a nail. The little wheel had weight and shape enough to disqualify itself. A gear was no stem. Stem belonged to something narrower, fitted rather than toothed, perhaps a pin, a winding arbor, a side piece one might pull or turn. The motion of comparing word to object clarified the clue by exclusion. Whatever the note referred to, it pointed toward a different kind of small part, one likely easy to remove or lose from a small timed object. The broad boxed repair from earlier in the trail had never sat comfortably with the timing language. Here, with side stem and last chime, and the repeated minute sharing one paper, the mismatch grew clearer. The broad boxed repair belonged elsewhere. This note pointed toward something more delicate, more exact, some clock-like object or chime-governed piece that mattered before it entered the parcel trouble at all. Edith rested the gear back on the chest edge and looked to the line again. If someone writes this for handling, she said, they expect the object already to be known. The note is for the process around it. A driftwood piece from the windowsill was brought over to hold the loosened intact parcel label flat while the folded letter was turned. The driftwood had been smoothed by water long before it ever came to the sill, and it sat kindly on the paper, heavy enough to keep a corner from lifting, light enough not to bruise. With the label secured, the folded letter could be angled under the light and checked for pressure marks from writing done on top of it when it lay in a stack. This took patience. The page had to be tipped one way, then another. The light had to glance across rather than fall straight down. At first, there seemed to be nothing but the ordinary valleys of old folds in the grain of paper. Then, near the boxed F, faint indenting appeared. Too shallow to read, too broken to form words, yet unmistakable once seen. The soft impressed traces left when another page had been written upon above this one. Curves and short lines crossed the lower section in a pattern unrelated to the visible text. The clue gave no recoverable message. It gave something quieter and, in its way, just as useful. The folded letter had sat within a stack of handling papers rather than alone. It had known repeated administrative contact. Other pages had leaned on it, been marked over it, traveled with it or near it. The page on the porch rail had lived a working life before it came to hide under weather notes. The torn parcel label stub was held beside the folded letter's lower edge in one simple, necessary test. If the fold had once been attached to some larger parcel paper, if a missing scrap had broken away and wandered into mystery only because it belonged physically to the same sheet, the fibers might tell. They did not. The torn edge of the stub and the smooth lower edge of the folded letter shared neither fit nor feathering. Their papers differed in body. The simplest explanation fell away without fuss. The damp gloves hanging nearby stirred once in the air and were left alone after a glance. Their moisture would have blurred whatever little the paper still held in its surfaces. Dry hands remained the rule. Flat rail, clear light, patient order. Much of the work here depended less on brilliance than on not spoiling what was already present. Attention returned to Ward 16. On the page, the phrase looked almost stranded. Edith considered it with the same expression she might bring to an address line missing half its town. On its own, she said, this is not how I would expect forwarding to be written. Her finger did not touch the words, only hovered close. It lacks the rest of the destination language. No route, no house, no room marker, unless Ward is serving that purpose inside a larger place. It could be a section within an address. It could be a storage area. It could be copied from an earlier note by someone who already knew the rest. That was narrow enough to be useful. The phrase could not be promoted into certainty simply because it sounded specific. Its incompleteness mattered as much as its precision. The repeated time asked for one more round of thought, this time with both papers and routine in view. The bakery collection card suggested one chain of movement. The parcel labels suggested relabeling and repeated handling. The folded letter suggested instructions nested inside that chain. If 8:16 marked a cutoff minute, then hold if after made immediate operational sense. If it marked a chime, then the note about the last chime and the side stem leaned closer to the object itself. If it marked the time something was set aside, then the margin repetition still argued for process, because no one copies a trivial memory into the margin with that sort of insistence. The number sat there, exact as a pin. Someone wanted no confusion, came the answer at last, spoken more to the page than to the porch. Whatever happened at that minute changed what should be done with the object. The line about the last chime had already altered shape once when spoken. It altered further when considered beside the possibility of a timed object. Chime no longer floated as a general sound in the world. It narrowed toward a known signal, a clock's note, a scheduled bell, a sound by which a handoff could be measured. If the reading held, then the missing object mattered in relation to a clock or chime schedule before it ever became a parcel problem. The broad boxed repair remained outside that lane. The mystery had shifted to what smaller timed thing, with a possible missing stem at its side, should have been there instead. The porch itself kept steady company with this work. Damp cloths breathed their soap-clean smell. The chest stood open, patient and dark. The enamel mug waited where it had been moved, old tea cooling under its ringed lip. Beyond the rail, the air from the river carried a softness that touched the papers and then moved on. Nothing hurried the scene except the knowledge that paper left too long outdoors becomes less readable with every change in weather. At last the papers were sorted into two groups. One held the parcel trail already known, the bakery collection card, the torn parcel label stub, the loosened intact parcel label. The other began as a single folded letter and then, by resemblance and handling and language, leaned itself into that first set until the separation became less about difference of subject and more about order of discovery. The weather notes, set apart now, no longer had any claim on it. Their role had been only to hide. That clarified the immediate answer that mattered most on the porch rail. The folded letter did not belong with the weather notes or with any ordinary cabin routine. It belonged with the parcel evidence and the unresolved trail marked by 816. They stood with that for a moment, not because more looking would change it, but because some conclusions need to settle into the hands before the hands begin moving again. It was hidden in a domestic place, Edith said, gathering the practical shape of it into words, and meant for someone who would know these papers mattered. The answer to whether it belonged where it had been found could now be given plainly. No, except in the sense that someone wanted it found later by the right person. The rail under the weather notes had served as a quiet holding place, chosen because it could pass for routine until routine itself lifted the pages. The unresolved questions were cleaner than they had been earlier, if no fewer. Whether the boxed F marks began with Larkin Loaf or earlier in the chain remained open. What Ward 16 actually pointed to remained open. What small-timed object, perhaps missing a side stem, was meant to move through hold or forwarding at 816 remained open. The broad boxed repair did not return to relevance under this new light. If anything, the folded letter strengthened its exclusion. The lane of evidence had narrowed, and in narrowing had become more trustworthy. The choice of who to involve changed there on the rail without ceremony. What had been meant as a simpler carrying onward of the bakery collection card, the torn parcel label stub, and the loosened intact parcel label became a different errand. The folded letter was added to the set. Edith was kept in the matter, not merely informed of it and sent on her way. Her usefulness had moved beyond witness. The new clue spoke in the language of holding and forwarding as much as timing, and that made her a practical partner in whatever came next. The folded letter was refolded along its existing crease with care enough not to sharpen the bend further. It was tucked with the parcel papers this time, clearly separate from the weather notes. The spare gear went back into the storage chest among its fellows, returned to its place now that it had served its brief second purpose as a comparison object. The lid came down. The hinges made their small complaint again, and then the chest closed with a neat click that settled the loose business of tools and parts. The weather notes were restored to their own order and slid back beneath the enamel mug ringed from old tea, where they could continue being exactly what they were meant to be. The mug resumed its old office as paperweight. That little domestic arrangement looked proper again. In hand, the evidence set had acquired one more layer and one more direction. The damp cloths and gloves still stirred faintly on the rail, answering the air in small movements. The porch boards held the last of their darker patches where moisture had not yet lifted. The papers, gathered now with intention, stayed dry between careful fingers. Nothing more on the rail needed solving before the next step. So the chapter of the morning's disturbance closed in order. Weather notes under the mug, chest shut, spare gear put away, and the folded letter carried with the bakery collection card and the parcel labels into the hold and forwarding trail it had quietly joined all along. Chapter 6. By afternoon, the old wood of the workbench had taken in its usual scents again. A little oil, a little metal, the dry sweetness of cloth lint shaken free from polishing rags. Brass dust lay in a fine weather across one corner where a case had been cleaned earlier, and a softer drift of pale fibers had gathered near the lamp base. Beneath the bench, the spare glass drawer gave its familiar dry hush when it slid open. The sound was so ordinary that it nearly passed without thought. A coat hem, still holding a trace of river damp from the walk back past the dock, brushed lightly against the stool leg as the kept pieces were checked by habit. Nothing in that first motion asked to be noticed. Small circles of glass rested in their partitions. A few larger covers lay in paper folds. One narrow compartment held two pieces where there ought to have been two. Another held three where there ought to have been three. The eye moved on in the steady way that comes from doing the same work many times, counting without counting aloud. On the edge of the bench, where they would stay in sight and not be lost among screws or springs, The folded letter sat beside the bakery collection card and the parcel labels. They had been set there together on purpose, close enough to compare, far enough from the oil tray to stay clean. Every so often, a glance drifted from the penciled 816 and the words, "Hold if after," to the watch parts under the lamp, then back again. The motion had become part of the work itself. A wheel was lifted, a screw was set down, a thought returned to timing, then to function. If the note meant anything practical, the bench might know it sooner than guesswork would. A winding stem waited near the front edge, bright in one place where handling had worn it smooth. It was taken up between finger and thumb and turned once before any case was opened, a tiny test done as much by touch as by sight. The movement through the fingertips mattered. A stem that looked sound could still drag or catch. The pause stretched only a breath or two, though it was enough to send one movement plate aside and clear the center of the bench into neat little groups. Loose stems went one way. A cloth square folded over itself and moved back. A tray shifted left. The letter remained where it was, opened enough to show the line about checking the side stem before the last chime. Better to set the words against metal than let them stay airy and uncertain. The drawer below came open again, and this time the count paused. A finger returned to the same partition. 1, 2, 3. Then the next. The space that should have held a spare glass cover for a small watch type showed only its shallow groove and the dust ring left by something that had rested there long enough to mark its circle. The missing piece was not gone far. A slight glint behind the display case, tucked where no stored part should have slipped, answered for it when the lamp was shifted and the angle changed. It had slid into the narrow place between case and wall, hidden by no more than chance and the thickness of shadow. The little cover came out carefully, pinched at the edge, and lifted free without scraping. It was no remarkable thing at first glance. Round, modest, clear enough despite a film at the rim. Yet its appearance at that moment changed the use of the bench at once. It was placed beside the folded letter rather than back in the drawer. A practical object had arrived in the wrong place at the wrong time, and that was enough. A second look steadied the thought. The cover belonged to a watch type that should have had a winding stem paired with it. The tray space where that mate ought to have rested did not merely look untidy. Dust had settled around absence in a clean ring. The groove itself held no fragment, no wrong piece dropped in by mistake. The mismatch was plain in the way a missing spoon in a drawer is plain to the hand before the eye names it. The lamp was drawn a little nearer. The small cover turned in the light, and a faint line appeared along the inner rim where handling had left a trace. What seemed at first to be ordinary smudge gathered itself into writing when the glass caught the glow just right. Grease pencil, nearly rubbed away. Only a few words remained clear enough to trust. 816 hold, and then a broken mark trailing off before it could settle into a full word. The cover stayed between finger and thumb while the eyes moved from that rubbed note to the folded paper on the bench. The closeness of the wording asked for attention. The letter had carried that same time and that same instruction to hold if late. Yet the line on the glass was thinner, hurried, written where only someone handling the piece closely would ever see it. A repair time could have been marked there. So could a collection time. So could an instruction copied in transit by someone who had no room to write more. The broken end of the last mark made every possibility stop short. The cover was turned again, slower now. The rim passed through the lamp glow in a bright arc and then dimmed. Near the notch where a winding stem would meet the case, two tiny marks flashed and vanished. The angle had to be found a second time before they held. Boxed F marks, scratched so lightly they disappeared unless the glass was tipped just so. One box, another beside it, small enough to be missed by anyone cleaning in haste, deliberate enough that they did not belong to wear. The folded letter lay open nearby with the same paired symbol. Did the marks begin with the bakery trail and get copied here? Did they begin here and travel outward with the parcel labels? A code repeated is not the same thing as a code created. The glass gave no answer. It only offered the duplication and kept the rest. A cloth was spread on the bench before the cover was set down. Once resting there, it showed another unevenness at its edge, a tiny roughness under the bezel seat where the fingertip caught on something that was neither chip nor crack. A nail eased at it gently. Paper lifted, no wider than a fingernail, curved like a pale crescent and still held by old paste along one side. Torn from a label. That much was clear before any writing was read. The paper had the softened stiffness of something that had once been wrapped around an object and handled by many fingers. Only 16 remained legible. Before it, the ghost of another letter or stroke showed in fibers too incomplete to settle. The fragment might once have belonged to Ward 16. It might have been part of a route mark, a shelf mark, a sorting note. The little crescent had traveled enough to lose certainty and keep only suggestion. Under the lamp, it looked both very small and very stubborn. For a while, the bench held still around these things. The movement plate remained where it had been set aside. The winding stem lay close by. The letter, the bakery collection card, the parcel labels, and the newly found cover formed a narrow line of evidence across the wood grain. The time on the rim echoed the paper note. The paired F marks echoed the letter. The paper fragment echoed the mention of Ward 16 without proving it. Every piece leaned toward the others. None locked cleanly into place. A thumb brushed the outer glass where dust had settled in a crescent of its own. The pressure left a clear path and revealed a faint difference in thickness near the notch. Wear, perhaps, or repeated fitting and removal. If this had been an ordinary spare, why mark it at all? If it had traveled with a parcel, why hide the marks where only a repairer would find them? A sender wanting speed would write on wrapping, not under a bezel seat. A handler wanting secrecy might do exactly this. Yet, secrecy seemed too grand a word for such practical little scratches and stop-short notes. The object felt less hidden than shepherded. The winding stem was lifted and held near the notch without seating it. The eye measured shape against shape. The fit looked plausible. The absent mate in the tray became easier to imagine. Not a whole watch, not a random bit of stock, but a small assembly that belonged together and had somehow been divided across the bench and drawer. The line in the letter about the side stem no longer drifted free in abstraction. It began to hover over actual metal. Still, no test was made yet. The hand that knew better than to force a thing before understanding set the stem back down. The room had settled into that afternoon hush, where every small sound seems to arrive from a little farther away than it does at noon. A tool shifted softly when the cloth beneath it was nudged. The display case glass gave back the lamp in a muted stripe. Outside, whatever weather lay over the harbor remained outside, leaving only the memory of damp in the coat and the faint coolness still clinging to its sleeve. The paper crescent drew attention again. Lifted with the point of a blade just enough to see its underside, it showed old paste turned amber in spots, chalky in others. Parcel stock often kept such traces after being damp and dried. Shop notes were usually cleaner, cut straighter, written larger. This tiny remnant had lived through handling. The edge where it tore away was fibrous and irregular, as if ripped from a wrapped surface in haste rather than trimmed off at a bench. The 16 mattered, though the kind of matter remained uncertain. Number of room, route, collection, district, batch. The smallest clues often carried the broadest possible meanings. Footsteps came near enough to be heard through the floorboards before the knock reached the doorframe. By the time Elias stepped in, a bakery collection card was already held out in one hand, its edge protected inside a saved paper sleeve softened by use. He entered only part way at first, attention going where the bench itself pointed it. The grouped parcel labels drew the eye before the watch parts did. Then the small glass cover beside them. Then the open letter. He came closer with the unhurried care of someone accustomed to reading what wrapping, marks, and set-aside things had to say. I brought the card back in its sleeve, he said, placing it near the others without covering any writing. It looked as though it had earned one. The sleeve had gone velvety at the folds. It had been reused enough times to remember hands. A nod answered him, while the cover was shifted slightly to make room. "There's more on this than there ought to be," came the quiet reply, and a fingertip touched the rim of the glass rather than the writing itself. He bent over the bench, not crowding it. The letter, labels, and card were taken in together before his gaze narrowed to the little cover. That wasn't with the porch things. No. Behind the display case. That answer was enough to keep him there a little longer. He had the calm habit of looking at edges before centers, at paper fibers before words. The card in its sleeve remained near his hand like a tool brought to the right task. Cold air brushed in at the door before it had fully closed from the last arrival. With it came the damp rope smell of the harbor, tar faint beneath salt, and the clean bite of outdoor chill. Gideon stepped inside with a coil of line looped once around his wrist, as if he had paused in work only long enough to come up from it. The line still held the shape of his grip. He stopped at the bench after 2 strides, took in the parcel labels at once, and then the arrangement around them. "That trail again," he said, with a glance from the labels to the cover. "Forwarding marks get copied by whoever needs a thing to keep moving on time. Doesn't have to be the one who sent it." The thought landed neatly among the objects already waiting for it. A parcel passed from hand to hand gathers repetition. One mark can survive because each keeper rewrites it, not because any one writer matters most. The harbor had taught him that much in ropes, crates, chalk notes, and weathered tags. Space was needed then, and the bench was made to provide it. Spare glass went to one side in a more deliberate row. Loose stems were gathered into a tray. Tagged repairs moved back beyond the lamp's brightest circle. What remained in the cleared center were the folded letter, the bakery collection card, the parcel labels, and the small glass cover on its cloth. The bench had become a comparison table without anyone naming it so. Elias eased the paper crescent into view beside the bakery collection card. He did not begin with the writing. Instead, he tilted both pieces under the lamp and looked at their fibers, their cut edges, the way old paste had dried on each. The cardstock was broader and less worn, but one corner where a label had once been affixed showed a familiar sheen. He slid the sleeve away and touched the surface lightly. "This stock has been handled," he murmured. "See how the paste sits flatter where fingers have warmed it. And this tear?" The crescent was brought close to the card's edge, not to match the exact shape, which would have been impossible, but to compare thickness and grain. The torn side of the fragment feathered in much the same way as the lifted edge on the card where a label had once been peeled. He turned them both, watching how the paper drank the light. "Parcel label stock," he said after a moment. "Not a shop slip. Old adhesive, too. It's lived on wrapping." The conclusion did not solve the number left on the fragment, yet it tied the little crescent more firmly to the parcel evidence than to any ordinary repair note. The cover had traveled in company with handled goods. Across from him, the winding stem was chosen from the group parts and brought to the notch in the cover's corresponding assembly. The fitting was done slowly, with pauses where another hand might have hurried. Metal met metal with that tiny resistance only fingertips can read well. The first turn gave a slip, a small, untrustworthy glide that did not catch. The stem came back a fraction. The angle changed. On the second turn, something found its proper place and engaged. The fitted piece was tested again, no further than needed. The resistance points became clearer with each careful movement. A tiny drag near one side, a cleaner take on the other. The body of the watch assembly, still incomplete, was teaching the meaning of the note by touch. Elias watched the motion rather than interrupting it. Gideon leaned one hand on the bench edge and followed the angle of the stem with the eye of someone who knew how gear and timing could depend on one correct approach among several almost right ones. So it had to be checked, he said, by someone who knew what catching felt like. The folded letter was brought nearer, held close enough that the penciled words could be read while the stem was tested once more. Under the hand, the phrase about the last chime shifted into a different shape. Earlier, it might have pointed toward a place, a bell, a schedule written somewhere else. Here, with the mechanism half engaged and the warning proving practical, the phrase belonged naturally to the behavior of a timed object. Before a striking cycle, before a hand reached a certain point, before some moment after which the setting would be wrong or troublesome to correct. If it arrived after the right point, Elias said, eyes on the letter, you'd hold it rather than set it badly. Or pass it on badly, came the answer, with another light turn of the stem. Gideon nodded once. That's forwarding sense. Better to keep a thing still than send it wrong. One of the parcel labels was turned over then, and the comparison moved away from fit and into writing. The rubbed grease pencil note on the glass was set near the label's abbreviated marks. Elias looked at the shape of the cramped strokes, the way both ended abruptly where a longer word might have continued if there had been room or time. On wrapped goods, people wrote with the parcel under one hand and haste under the other. Letters narrowed, endings vanished. Notes stopped short because they only had to survive to the next keeper. This is the same sort of stopping place, he said, tracing the air above the label rather than touching it. A hurried surface, a wrapped goods hand. It did not identify the writer. Yet the resemblance strengthened Gideon's harbor-born thought. The marks looked copied forward through use, repeated because the object had to keep moving and keep being understood. Near the lamp, the movement plate with the fine scratch was lifted from where it had waited since the opening motions. Angled into the light, the line on it showed more clearly now that there was something to compare it to. It was too deliberate for wear, too slight for decoration. A tiny directional sign, perhaps, made by someone who preferred a scratch to a written note where notes might rub away. The plate was set beside the small glass cover, then shifted, then turned a little. The scratch aligned with the side where the winding stem had caught most cleanly. Once seen, the relation was difficult to unsee. The mark did not explain itself in words, but it pointed. Here. This side. This orientation. A handoff mark, Gideon said softly, like a line on gear for the right set. A soft tap against the bench tested how firmly the movement sat. The sound answered before force could. It was not seated as securely as a finished repair should have been. The hand stopped there, refusing the temptation to press further for certainty. Better to leave an incomplete thing honest than damage it in the name of proof. That restraint narrowed the matter all by itself. Whoever had passed this along had been preserving something workable and unfinished. This was no polished piece meant for sale, no display watch tucked away complete and ready. It was a watch part, or several parts, being kept in useful relation until the right person could check them. The parcel labels were spread then in a new order, no longer by writing or neatness, but by wear. Gideon took to that sorting naturally, as if handling old tags from different boats. The most rubbed label went to the left, the one with the freshest surface to the right. Smudges, softened corners, and faded folds made their own sequence. Along that line, the boxed F marks told a quiet story. The faintest one sat on the oldest handling layer. A clearer one appeared on a newer piece, the sharpest on the freshest. It traveled, he said, touching above each in turn without contact. Same mark kept alive. No one at the bench argued with that. The symbol had passed through multiple keepers. Whether it began before the bakery trail or somewhere within it remained open, though its path forward now seemed plain enough. Repetition had preserved it. Attention returned to the empty groove in the tray. The fitted winding stem was checked against it. The movement plate with the fine scratch was checked too. The absent combination became easy to picture in the mind's hand. These pieces belonging near one another, removed and separated just enough to keep them safe or to keep them from being mistaken for finished stock. The parcel trail concerned no whole clock, no random spare tucked into wrapping to fill space. It concerned a small watch assembly that had to remain in working relation until timing and side alignment could be verified. The phrase Ward 16 was spoken once into the room, not as a conclusion, but as a test against everything now on the bench. It did not settle. The fit of the stem did not answer it. The wear on the labels did not answer it. The marks on the cover did not answer it. Room, route, district, stop, sorting instruction, all still possible. Yet the fragment no longer floated apart from the others like an unrelated porch note. It belonged to the same sequence of handling as the timed watch assembly. That part can wait, Elias said, easing the paper crescent back down. It has company now, at least. The small glass cover, the movement plate with its fine scratch, and the correctly catching winding stem were brought together with greater confidence than before. Side by side, then in careful relation, they made practical sense as one incomplete unit. The letter no longer looked like a set of disconnected warnings. It looked as though it had been written for someone expected to know enough to test function, not merely to read and obey. Elias reached into the paper sleeve and drew out a fresh wrap, folding it on the cleared bench with the same tidy care he had used for collection cards and labels before. The paper was plain and sound. The assembled pieces were placed within it so they would rest together without rubbing. Beside them, though not mixed in, the bakery collection card and parcel labels were laid in their own order. Evidence and objects stayed clearly related but separate, each allowed to remain what it was. The wrapping itself answered a practical need the mystery had created. Loose parts no longer sat exposed among routine repairs, where a hand might shift them thoughtlessly. The watch assembly had a resting place now, deliberate and safe. Below the bench, the spare glass drawer opened one more time. Its order changed before it closed. The empty groove was left marked by absence rather than hastily filled. Unrelated pieces were shifted away from that partition so no future glance would smooth over what had been found. The place where the small cover had gone missing remained intentionally unoccupied, preserving the truth of the discovery instead of letting the drawer swallow it back into ordinary stock. On the bench above, the folded letter was smoothed once more. The penciled 816, the instruction to hold if late, the paired boxed F marks, and Ward 16 no longer sat as isolated fragments. They attached themselves now to a real mechanical need. Some part of the note still resisted naming. The number might yet point somewhere beyond the bench. The symbol might still carry a history older than the bakery route, yet the central uncertainty had narrowed. The parcel trail concerned a small timed object whose side stem catch and timing mattered enough that several handlers had preserved the warning and passed it onward. Gideon gave the wrapped bundle a brief look that said his part in the matter had reached its natural end. "If it's moving by hands and hours," he said, "that much I know. The finer teeth are yours." A small exchange followed, practical and short, enough to leave him satisfied that his route-wise guess had been of use. The coil of line was still around his wrist when he turned away. Cold water and rope went with him as he stepped back out, taking the harbor air from the room in stages as the door settled closed. Elias remained near the bench. He watched while the paper-wrapped pieces were set square, then adjusted by the breadth of a fingertip so they would not overhang the cloth beneath. His presence there suited the new order of things. The card sleeve lay folded back. The parcel labels rested beside it. Nothing was hurried now that the clues had been gathered into relation. A cloth passed over the open stretch of wood, lifting brass dust and lint into its weave. The bench cleared until only the wrapped watch assembly and the folded letter packet remained within easy reach, placed where they could be found at once and not disappear among the evening's ordinary repairs. Around them, the room resumed its gentler sounds. Drawer wood settled. A small tool touched another with a quiet clink. The lamp hummed low enough to be almost imagined. The fitted winding stem was tested one final time before the pieces were covered for the night. The turn caught cleanly enough to satisfy the fingers that had learned its resistance over the course of the afternoon. No more was asked of it. The motion ended there. Beside the bench, Elias stayed long enough to see everything set in one understood place. Warm wood under the lamp, paper folded true, the hidden problem brought out from behind drawers and labels into patient hands. And that is where our story rests for today. Thank you for listening and for spending this quiet time with Cozy Tales. Until next time, rest well.